of the council, and I call this meeting to order. It's the regular meeting of the Met Council, Wednesday, August 10th, 2022. So the first item is the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? Seeing none, we'll accept it as printed and move on to approval of the minutes. I will need a motion and a second to approve the minutes of July 27th. Is there a motion and a second?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. There's been a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on the minutes? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Minutes are adopted. Next is public invitation. If there is anyone here to speak of anything that is not on the agenda, I don't believe anyone has signed up, have they? No, they have not. So we will move on to the business. So our first item is a joint report from Transportation, Community Development, and Management. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is business item 2022-146. It's a joint business item and it's part of the Unified Budget Amendment. The 2022 second quarter budget amendment incorporates changes to the regional administration and MTS operating budget and the Community Development, Metropolitan Transportation Services, and the Metro Transit capital budget. The amendment was reviewed and approved by the Community Development Committee on July 18th, the Transportation Committee on July 25th, and the Management Committee on July 27th. In regional administration, the amendments adds an FTE in procurement to provide training to project management and to provide assistance with contractor amendments, disputes, and closeouts. The amendment also describes an additional project that will be added to the list of projects approved by the Council for 2021 equity grants funded by the General Fund. This is a $90,000 project for a partnership between Metro Transit and a local academic provider to create a new pathway program for workforce development. In MTS, the amendment moves $515,000 in MVEST from the contracted services operating budget to the capital budget, and $515,000 in federal funds from the contracted services capital budget to the operating budget. In the community development capital budget, the amendment closes 6 parks projects that have been completed. It also authorizes $23.6 million in state legacy funds and council match for land acquisition and parks project, and makes administrative adjustments among 10 parks and 1 HRA capital project. In the transportation capital budget, this amendment reallocates funds among 4 projects in the Metro Transit capital program and changes the funding among 37 projects. Most notably, it provides $20.9 million in federal funds and $3.7 million in MVEST funds for a purchase of 18 biodiesel buses. In MTS, the amendment adjusts the funding within 7 projects, closes 3 projects, and changes the funding for 23 projects. So, Madam Chair, the motion is that the Metropolitan Council authorizes the 2022 unified budget as amended and in accordance with the attached tables, and I so move.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Is there any discussion, any questions? Seeing and hearing none. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries.
Madam Chair, are we supposed to do a roll call for budget items?
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so.
Roll call.
Do we have, pardon? Okay.
I'll do the roll call. Councilmember Johnson,
Aye.
Barber,
Aye.
Pacheco,
Aye.
Lilligren,
Aye.
Amin,
Aye.
Zurin,
Aye.
Lindstrom,
Aye.
Bento,
Aye.
Gonzalez,
Aye.
Lee,
Aye.
Sterner,
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you, Councilmember Wolf. I missed that on my sheet here. I appreciate that.
And Madam Chair, if I
Yes.
might just thank staff, all of the departments that have put a lot of work into this, and the committees that reviewed all of this. There are, again, some great projects moving forward with great partnerships and also procurement. So thanks to everybody involved.
Thank you. Moving on to the consent agenda. There are 2 items on consent. Is there a motion to approve consent?
Move approval.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on this? Seeing and hearing none. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None opposed. That motion carries. Moving into the reports of the standing committees. Community Development has their reports on the consent agenda. Next is the Environment Committee. Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have before us this afternoon two contracts, 21P297A-F for full service and process mechanical plant engineering services with not to exceed amounts as listed within the business item. We issued an RFP, request for proposals, on January 6, 2022. And in alignment with our commitment to inclusivity, 7 of the 33 plan holders identified as minority, women, small veteran, or disadvantaged business enterprises. The evaluation panel of council staff and external stakeholders ranked 14 proposals and selected the most technically qualified proposers. Following approval of the evaluation panel, the cost data was reviewed by a negotiation panel and agreed that the final prices have been determined to be fair and reasonable, and recommended the 6 proposers listed in the business item as the most advantageous for the council. And to be transparent, we did receive an anonymous email, which is included in the committee report materials, claiming that the firms selected do not have sufficient staff within the area to fulfill the contract. Staff from both procurement and the Office of Equity and Equal Opportunity confirmed the evaluation panel abided by a process which is thorough and selects for qualified and competent proposers to carry out the work outlined in the scope of services. Therefore, Madam Chair and members of the council, I move that the Met Council authorize the regional administrator to award and execute contracts 21P297A-F for full service and process mechanical plant engineering services with not to exceed amounts as provided in the business item.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Are there any questions? Hearing and seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries. Thank you. Moving on, management has no report tonight. Transportation Committee is on the consent agenda. So moving into information, we're going to hear our first information item, 2021 population estimates. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Chair Cummings. I am Matt Schroeder, struggling with this chair, which does not have wheels on it. And I'm the latest in a long line of people to say how nice it is to be back presenting in person. I am here today to talk about the 2021 population estimates, which wrapped up last month. I want to start by just emphasizing that estimates are really just estimates. So this quote on the screen, estimating is what you do when you don't know, may seem like a truism that's not even worth mentioning, but I want to put the emphasis here on when you don't know, because nobody, not the Met Council, not the Census Bureau, Internal Revenue Service, even Google or Facebook, really knows how many people live in the region at any given time. So all we can do is to take our best guess based on the data available to us and then have some humility about the results. So that's kind of, I guess, the biggest picture context for the estimates. But I'll give a bit more context in a second, talk about the patterns that we're seeing in the 2021 estimates, which is slower and less spatially balanced growth than we saw in the past decade. Talk about some factors about why that is, talk about some differences between the Metropolitan Council and the Census Bureau estimates, which were very different this year, much more so than in the past, and then finally look ahead to what the 2022 estimates might look like next year. But to start off by clearing up a frequent source of confusion, estimates are distinct from these other data products that we have. So we have the decennial census, the American Community Survey, and then the estimates. So the census, as we heard a lot about last fall, does as complete a count of people as the Census Bureau can manage, carried out every 10 years, doesn't tell us a lot about people, but does at least try to give us a firm number. The American Community Survey, though, does kind of fill in those gaps with more detailed characteristics. It is carried out every year, unlike the census, but all we get is a sample of people. So population estimates are kind of in the middle of those. Like the census, they're really just trying to give us a basic, in this case, estimate of the number of people, the totals in the region and in cities and townships. But like the ACS, it's carried out every year. So we're, in this case, looking in this rearview mirror back to 2021, April 1st, 2021. We're always looking at the past year for estimates, which is different from forecasts. And this is kind of the thing that a lot of people confuse, especially in some local governments. So forecasts are looking ahead to future decades based on these data sources and many others and sophisticated models. But estimates, we're really looking back in time, forecasts ahead in time. And these are really a collaborative effort. We at the Met Council do the population estimates for the 7-county Twin Cities region. The State Demographic Center does those for Greater Minnesota. And then local governments, though, have a really critical role to play. They supply us with really important data. They review the preliminary estimates that we sent out in May. And then if they wanted to, they commented or challenged the estimates to the extent that they saw issues in them. And this year, 6 cities submitted comments that resulted in some revisions. Typically, these were correcting housing stock data or providing additional data that shed some light on occupancy rates. 8 cities submitted comments that were more like questions, which once we kind of clarified how the estimates are calculated and what goes into them, they were kind of resolved that way. And then finally, we initiated some really minor revisions to another 10 cities and townships, just correcting a small data error. And what I mean by small revisions is on the order of 10 people per city or township, so very minor. But then to set the stage for what the 2021 estimates say, useful, I think, to look back at this slide from last fall when the 2020 census came out, looking at how steady the population growth had been between 2010 and 2020. So this gives the population for each decade back to 1900. So we added more than 313,000 people between 2010 and 2020, good for an 11% growth rate, about 1% per year. What we're seeing in the 2021 estimates, though, is that the lower right corner of this table shows a 0.7% growth rate for the population, so less than we had in the past. So we gained about 21,000 housing units, about 15,000 households, and about 23,000 people in total. And as I mentioned, this is not as strong growth as we'd had in that past decade. So we added about 31,000 people in an average year between 2010 and 2020. In this most recent year, 2020 through 2021, about 23,000 people, as I mentioned. So definitely less growth than in the past decade. Not as low as in the 2000s, but still noticeably lower. And another, I guess, comparison we can make is where that growth went. So this map is showing the growth rates for each city and township in the region. So darker shades of green here show faster growth rates, and then those shades of brown show communities that lost population. Not necessarily a lot. Often these are small losses, but still losses nevertheless. And so then flipping back and forth between the past decade and then post-2020, some pretty big differences emerged. So more communities lost population. And then you'll see that the growth has maybe shifted a little bit to the West Metro. And there, I guess, it may be a little hard to see from the map just because there are so many, but I guess a couple summaries that we can see here is that the population changes have really been more extreme. So the number of communities in that most rapid growth category increased, as did the number of communities losing population, while those middle two categories, the moderate and the slow growth, that really kind of got hollowed out. And I don't want to make too much of this. This is really just 1 year of estimates. Things kind of started out similarly in the past decade as we came out of the Great Recession, but still these are trends that bear watching in future years. And then another way to look at this is in Thrive MSP 2040 community designations. And here we're seeing that, as the maps kind of hinted at, the emerging suburban edge and suburban edge communities in yellow really are showing, in fact, more growth than an average year in the past decade, where urban and suburban, urban center communities, their growth has declined a bit. So still, urban center communities, for example, that was kind of the big headline from the 2020 census results, that the urban center communities grew much more than they had in past decades. So that's less true now. Still growing, certainly, but that total growth has kind of shifted more toward the edge of the region. And again, 1 year of estimates, but trends that deserve looking at and monitoring. To get into why this is, I think it's helpful to understand how these estimates are calculated and the different levers that move them up or down. So people move around all the time. That is really, really hard to track. And people are born and die all the time. So again, there's not very good data on this at the very local level. So what we do instead is to focus on what we do have a much better picture of, which is housing units. So we start with the 2020 census housing units, add on the changes to the housing stock since 2020, which communities submit to us in our annual building permit survey to get to the number of housing units. Then we can use what we know about occupancy rates, basically just the opposite of vacancy rates, to apply those to housing units to get to the number of households, and then to apply average household sizes to get to the number of people living in those households, and then finally adding on the group quarters population, people living in college dormitories or nursing homes or prisons, to get to the total population. These boxes in green show what come from our annual surveys or the 2020 census. So these are known. We have a pretty good sense of these. The blue boxes, though, those are more estimates that we need to compile from a variety of different data sources. So looking at these different levers, it's clear that this slower growth was not due to any drop-off in housing construction. The number of housing units permitted in 2020 was really almost as high as it was in 2019. So there wasn't the sort of steep drop in housing production that would otherwise, excuse me, result in a population loss. We do, though, see a decline in occupancy rates. So I mentioned before, the same slide from before, that we added 21,000 housing units, but just 15,000 households. So we have more vacant housing units than we did in 2020. And so the overall region's occupancy rate declined, according to our estimates, from 95.7% to 95.3%. This is just a reflection of other trends that have been going on. So we really see this most strongly among the multifamily apartments. I think that occupancy rate dropped like 1.5 percentage points, not so much in other forms of housing. But again, this is kind of one factor resulting in that drop in population. And then we can also look at household sizes, which is not completely separate from the group quarters population, but still I think makes sense to talk about here, which is you really see a strong effect from COVID, that we have fewer births and more deaths than we used to. And so this is really getting at this concept of natural increase. The more births we have and the fewer deaths we have, the more our population grows. So looking at the years before 2020, in average, in that left column, we had nearly 39,000 births in an average year, about 21,000 deaths. So our population grew on average by nearly 18,000 people a year. In the year before 2021, though, post-COVID, we had about 36,000 births, about 26,000 deaths, so a net change of really just 10,000. So that natural increase dropped by 7,700 people. So that's another factor in this slower growth, fewer births, more deaths. And then another big factor is that group quarters population, that final component of the estimates I talked about. primarily among the University of Minnesota, who, and their dormitories lost about 3,500 people between 2020 and 2021, which is, I think, more than half, I think, of what they had before. Pre-COVID. Other colleges did as well, St. Kate's, Bethel, Hamlin, but really the U of M was hit pretty hard. And then we saw as well some declines in the state prison population too. Lino Lake, Stillwater, Shakopee. These populations have been declining for over the past several years, but not nearly this much. So again, some more factors creating this, resulting in this slower growth. You may have seen this headline in late March from the Star Tribune that that Hennepin and Ramsey counties had lost a lot of population. And according to the Census Bureau's estimates, they had Hennepin lost about 1.1%, Ramsey 1.6%. So pretty strong, pretty large population losses compared to the past. And that these more than offset the population gains in the other 5 counties, resulting in that regional loss of minus 0.3% at the top there. We were really confused when we saw this, since this didn't square with what we saw in other data sources. So, I mean, namely the rapid pace of housing construction. Hennepin and Ramsey counties, according to our survey results, added, I think, more than 11,000 housing units between 2020 and 2021. So to get this sort of a population drop, we need to see this complete crash in occupancy rates, which, again, isn't what we saw in the data. Those trends have been pretty similar across the counties. So digging into this a bit more, it really has to do with domestic migration. That was the Census Bureau's main component. So more people are moving out, according to the Census Bureau, of Hennepin and Ramsey counties than move in. And this has historically been true. But what's new, I guess, is the degree to which that's been happening in the Census Bureau estimates. So for Hennepin County, for example, the Census Bureau estimated, I think, around 5,000, a net loss of 5,000 people due to migration before the 2021 estimates. I think nearly 19,000 in the year before the 2021 estimates. So a 241% increase, more than triple the rate of outmigration before that. We don't, as I said, calculate migration estimates ourselves. That's pretty difficult to do. But we do have this other source of data that the U.S. Postal Service started publishing, which is change of address requests. So another picture of migration. And that does show an increase in outmigration in Hennepin and Ramsey counties, but a much smaller one, so about 28% in both of those. So yes, according to the U.S. Postal Service data, outmigration has increased in Hennepin and Ramsey counties, and it's the other 5 counties have more in-migration than they used to, but those patterns are not nearly as pronounced in that data as they are in the Census Bureau's estimates. And so it's really that domestic migration that we're pretty skeptical of. And then another factor, since that Star Tribune article kind of tossed around some possible local factors for this drop, I think it's also important to put this in national context, which is that there are a lot of what you might call core counties, counties with these large cities like Boston or LA or Portland, that according to the Census Bureau's estimates also lost population between 2020 and 2021. So this is not solely a Twin Cities dynamic in the Census Bureau's estimates. This is very much a national one, having to do with lots of different trends that related to the pandemic. So then, looking ahead a bit to next year, are we going to see kind of the same slower growth rate that we've been experiencing over the past year, or might it look more like the past decade as we start to come out of the start to, we hope, emerge from the pandemic? So there are some factors pointing toward a return to that more like that growth rate of the past decade. We had nearly 3,000 more housing units permitted in 2021 than we did in 2020, so really record housing construction. Occupancy rates seem to be trending higher. The drop in births has kind of returned to normal. A little bit fewer deaths. We still had that Omicron wave from last fall, but fewer than in the year preceding 2021. And then finally, the U of M dorms, the University of Minnesota dorms, have kind of come back up to their pre-pandemic levels. There are some other factors, though, that kind of point to a continuation of this slower growth rate, which is there's some evidence of increased outmigration, not so much Hennepin and Ramsey counties as in those other 5. Some group quarters facilities among colleges and universities are continuing to lose population. And then there are continued ongoing signs of coming recession and a cooling homeownership market. So it'll we'll have to wait and see how, if those kind of take effect and slow things down. And then finally, some wild cards that we'll just have to wait and see about, which is how developers might respond to housing policy shifts in the region, and then any further mutations that coronavirus makes, and then what effect that has in the COVID pandemic. And then finally, what effects the extreme weather events fueled by climate change might have on where people move to. So all these are some different factors that will be really interesting to see next year, how things look. But with that, I will wrap up. Happy to take whatever questions you have, and always feel free to email as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you for that presentation. It's really interesting information. Of course, it has such an impact on everything that we do. Are there any questions? Yes, Mr. Lee.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Mr. Schroeder. I don't know if this is in your wheelhouse, but on slides 8 and 9, you show that the population is shifting further west, and so my question is relating to like our infrastructure and facilities. Then would we, for example, we have 150 units of affordable housing that we own physically. So would we try to move those out west or buy more properties out further west to adapt to that kind of geographic equity?
Chair Cummings, Councilmember Lee, it's a great question about kind of knowing where our infrastructure needs to go, and that includes housing. I mean, as Chair Cummings just said, I mean, our estimates really do capture a lot of trends in the region that informs what needs to happen with planning. I think my housing policy colleagues are probably better situated to speak on that than I am. But from what I understand, we have a policy in the Housing Policy Plan and Thrive MSP 2040 of trying to encourage housing choices across the region, including affordable housing in areas that don't have as much of it already. As well, there's the allocation of affordable housing need that affects how communities need to plan for densities sufficient to encourage the construction of affordable housing. So I think there's a pretty strong foundation of planning that goes into this, and so over the long term, I would guess, as these communities continue to grow, that's probably where you would see increased demand for affordable housing and other infrastructure facets as well.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes. Councilmember Gonzalez, sorry.
Thank you. Just 2 questions, and I think that Councilmember Lee was kind of talking about the same issues on both maps on 8 and 9, on slides 8 and 9. My question is, I'm wondering about the difference in the populations. I'm looking at a slide 9, in which it shows the growth, as Councilmember Lee observed, on the western part of the region, but then a decrease on the southeastern side. I believe that's Dakota County. I'm just south of Washington County. Mm-hmm. Anyways, and I'm trying to see what will be the cause of that, because those 2 areas seem to be pretty similar in composition, the western end and the southeastern end, in terms of being more rural, etc. But one is showing strong growth, and the other region is showing a population loss. Just interesting to know why that is.
Chair Cummings, Councilmember Gonzalez, thanks for the question. That is one that I suspected a lot of people would have. I think I guess I would point to two separate factors. One, excuse me, is what you might call the demographic headwinds the region was facing. So as I said, fewer births and more deaths. So that was kind of pressing down on growth rates to begin with. And given that, what really tended to swing the variation in communities for the estimates was housing construction. So a lot of it in, again, as I said, those edge communities in the West Metro, not as much in those more rural areas in southeastern Dakota County. And I should add, too, that these population losses, the communities that show up in brown shades here, are usually not huge losses. But given those, that foundation of fewer births and more deaths, that is, communities that did not add a lot of housing tended to lose some population. And then communities that did build a lot of housing kind of offset the decline due to COVID and the other factors that I mentioned.
Yes.
And I have a separate question, which is regarding the composition of the demographics. Do we have any information about the ethnicity of the region, the changes in those categories as the population numbers themselves change? Are we seeing increased numbers of certain groups, decrease in the numbers of certain groups? Do we have that data somewhere?
Chair Cummings, Councilmember Gonzalez, I apologize. I meant to pull that data in advance of this presentation. That is not something that we estimate ourselves, but it is something that the Census Bureau estimates. So even though, as I mentioned, the absolute estimates, the numbers of people, we're not quite sure about, it is, I think, instructive to look at the percentages from the Census Bureau's estimates. So that is something that I will pull together and get to you later.
Do you have like a ballpark idea of whether we're seeing an increase in diversity, a decrease, stable?
Yes, I believe they do show an increase in racial and ethnic diversity.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Johnson and then Councilmember Sterner.
I think Councilmember Sterner, were you ahead of me?
Go ahead.
When it is to this point. So I represent a good chunk of this area that we're looking at on slide 9. And, what I can say is a couple of things. So you've got the suburban communities, even Plymouth, which is we're at the tail end of development. So we're starting into redevelopment, so that's why that's slow. Maple Grove is, again, almost fully developed. But all of those communities that you see in the green line, they're right on the edge now where the MUSA is expanding. I would also note, and I could be wrong, but the populations of those communities, whether it's Corcoran, Medina, Independence, Greenfield, they don't have dense populations to begin with. So, you get a couple developments out there and you see a pop in their growth rate, but they're not dense like even the communities of Maple Grove and Plymouth. And based on what I know and what the comp plans are showing, I don't think they'll ever get to that level, but, certainly they're working their comp plans. So there's that. I would also say, not in a comparison to other parts of the region, but what I know about my part of the region is there are a strong diversity in jobs available, whether that be in good manufacturing jobs, to headquarters, to med tech, biotech. We pull people in all the way from, quite frankly, even western Minnesota. They're coming in on Highway 55 and 12, so it's a job center. And then when you add to that the strength of the public school systems, private schools, there does seem to be folks that can afford to live in this part of the region that are moving there because of those market forces, I guess I would say, that the realtors are pushing in all of their materials. And so I can just only say what I've noticed as far as the communities that I represent and what they're dealing with as they're kind of grappling with this push for continued development in their communities. And even thanks to the community development staff, having some of them, getting some consultants and staff help on that to manage their comp plan growth. So that's just some insights that I have. And I would say too, even looking at the census over the past 2 decennial reports that have come out, it is definitely becoming more diverse, and you can absolutely see that in the school system. So that's just my sense of what's going on in the part I represent.
Councilmember, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Mr. Schroeder? Or should we move on to the next question?
Yeah, thanks, Chair Cummings and Councilmember Johnson. Really helpful local information to me as well. But just wanted to thank you for reinforcing that these are growth rates and not absolute numbers. So this does, even though they're not adding necessarily hundreds of people, they do show up pretty prominently on the map because, as you pointed out, Councilmember Johnson, they're starting from a smaller base.
Councilmember Sterner.
Right. Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Schroeder, I'll just ask kind of a compound question here. So you mentioned a little bit about the group housing with prisons and that type of thing and dormitories, but what about our tent communities, several tent communities and sheltered and unsheltered people? How are we counting that, and is that in there? And I'm also wondering about the economic price with inflation going up, and that a part of our occupancy rate drop, and if that's related where the affordability on our affordable housing, it makes it where people can't afford, they're kind of becoming unsheltered, that type of thing. So just ask about that.
Yeah, thank you. Chair Cummings, Councilmember Sterner. I guess those really important questions. I'm not sure I can speak to any direct link between evictions and the unsheltered population. I would say that they do show up in a couple ways in our estimates. One is that we do get data from counties, and in some cases surveys every year on the shelters and permanent supportive housing and things like that. So we do capture the unhoused people in that way. The other is that we also have data from the 2020 census on, from what we've been able to tell, it's very difficult to tell, to get into the weeds a little bit, but it does seem like they did capture the population in encampments and the unsheltered population that way. So those kind of are held over from the previous year of estimates. One of the things that we've been wanting to do for a while but haven't quite figured out a good way is to look at the change over time in that, given that we don't enumerate encampments ourselves, and given that things do change from 2020. So the data that the Census Bureau gathered in 2020, given our changing landscape, is going to be different. How to account for that, I guess, in our estimates. So although in some our estimates do contain the unsheltered population, it's I guess more difficult to say how well they reflect the changes since 2020. As in, aside from emergency shelters.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? No. This was fascinating, thank you. And certainly you've illustrated the complexity of the issue and the questions that have come and the comments that have come from the council. It's very interesting. It will be interesting to watch the trends as we move forward and how they go. So
Yeah,
thank you very much.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you, Chair Cummings.
Thank you.
So our final item today is the 2023 preliminary budget and levies. Marie Henderson and staff. Welcome. Nice to see you in person again.
Yes. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and committee members. I am Marie Henderson. I'm the Deputy CFO here at the Council. And today you are going to hear from finance directors and division leaders about our preliminary 2023 operating budget and levies. This presentation will contain financial data for the budget, but it will also include stories of how the budget dollars will be used to benefit our region. And a little bit, so let's just back up a little bit there. There will be discussions, or there has been discussions at the committees about the division levy level budgets, And tonight is your first opportunity to hear about the proposed operating budget as a whole. The preliminary budget is not the end of our budgetary cycle. It is just the step along the way. And we have two statutory deadlines. They're highlighted in red on this particular slide. The budget we are proposing today will ask to adopt on a business item at the August 24th council meeting. And it will establish the upper limits for a proposed tax levy. After September 1st, the council may lower the levy, but not raise the rate as a total levy amount. Metro area counties will consider our levy amounts in establishing their own budgets and tax levies, and will mail out the truth in taxation notifications to property owners showing the proposed amounts of property taxes for all taxing jurisdictions. As we move along our budget development timeline throughout public comment, draft, and final adoption to our budget in December, we can and historically have adjusted our operating budget. However, we cannot make budgetary changes or increases to the levy. So our preliminary focus will be on the operating budget tonight, which is our operating budget, our pass-through debt service, and other operating benefits. In October, after discussions take place at the committee level, we will come back to highlight the capital program consisting of authorized projects, our 6-year plan, and our proposed spending for 2023. Council members, we refer to the preliminary operating budget presented today as the regional administrator's recommended budget as required by statute and is submitted by the council for approval. Ultimately, as we go through the public comment and final adoption, it becomes the council's budget. We'll review the property tax levy. Probably why I see that slide twice, so it threw me off. Sorry about that. Our levy, the council has authority in state statute to levy on property tax in the metro area for specific purposes to fund our grant and loan programs, debt service obligations, and limited way for general purposes. We have two main sections of the levy. First, the non-debt service levy, and then the debt service levy. Our non-debt service levy is limited by the increase each year according to the measurement of government inflation called the implicit rate deflator. Over the past 10 years, the average of this increase has been 2%. Throughout the years, and sometimes we've seen less than 1%. However, in 2023, the increase is 8.5%. Our debt service levies are not limited by this inflation rate, but for transit and parks are effectively limited by statutory on the authority granted to us for issuing debt. Our wastewater debt is secured primarily through wastewater fees, but secondarily by a full faith and credit of the council, through which we have never needed to levy for wastewater debt services. When we look at our debt levy strategy, the council sets a strategy, and the first piece of that is that we meet our debt service levies, needs for parks and transit. We also receive $5 million annually from the Fiscal Disparity and Tax Base Revitalization Account, and this program is tax-based shared programming within the metropolitan area and is funded by commercial and industrial properties, not by homeowners. We also have a strategy-based decisions. We maximize our livable communities demonstration account, maximize our general purpose levy, and hold our levy at an overall 2% increase year over year. Finally, we continue to have significant funds in our highway right-of-way program, and therefore we have not had a need recently to levy for that piece of it. When we look at our levy givens, the balance between our debt service and our non-debt service levies, there's pressure from transit that impacts the sustainability of our overall levy being held at 2%. The future use, the primary use of our regional debt bonding is our fleet replacement, and we've have been successful with legislation to gain an increase of our annual bonding authority and reflects a 4.5% inflationary bus replacement. That puts a big pressure onto our capital program and also then puts pressure onto the rest of the levy. These pressures would indicate the need for higher annual growth of our total levy, but historically, we've been able to manage within that 2%, mainly because of our parks parks levy and not needing the right of highway program. So for livable communities, in reviewing our non-debt section, this tax-based revitalization, like I talked about, is that $5 million. We also can maximize this levy by the implicit price deflator. The levy proposal for 2023 is at $14.1 million. And by maximizing this levy strategy, we create a transit orientation development component within the livable communities demonstration account. In the past, we've had a goal to say $13.2 million. We passed that goal this year. Because of that, we've changed the goal to say let's maximize the levy using the price deflator. This goal is present to be reached, and it was met. So like I said, we're reaching that goal. Our general purpose levy is proposed at $18 million. Primary is used within our community development administration and HRA funds. Statutory transfers that are required for local housing incentive account, and a new strategy along with maximizing the livable community account is to have the general purpose levy contribute $500,000 to the local incentive account to help with inflationary issues. This will leave around $2.1 million as we start investing a capital investment into the technologies here into the council. Maybe just easier to see the dollars and talk about them that way. So when we place this all together and breaks out the top part as non-debt service levies and then the bottom as the debt service levies. By maximizing the non-debt, that does put pressure on the debt side of it. We are able to pay our outstanding debt services staying within that 2%. We know, though, that looking into the future with historical costs going up and possibly putting more pressure into that debt service levies, in future years, we may not be able to maximize the non-debt service levies, or we increase the total at 2%. But we have confidence for the 2023 property tax levy that we can hold it at 2%. So what does that mean for the community? When we look at the chart, we have the taxing authority levies across the 7-county metro area. Inside the blue area is the transit debt service that would also be sharing a part of the levy. So the impact on a homeowner, when we look at a home average value of $300,000, with the caveat that not all things are being equal year over year. And if you reside within the transit taxing authority, you'll pay around $55, and outside the taxing authority, pay $20. It is mostly flat year over year from the 2022 proposal that we had. And of course, not all things are equal, and not all things are year over year, and not everybody has the market value of those homes. When we look at the overall impact of the taxpayer, we continue to be good stewards with our levy. We have put our levy in context here with the other metro area taxing jurisdictions, and the council has a declining share of the revenue of property taxes in the metro area. In perspective, I've been here with the council a little over 8 years. When I started, this was over 2%. Now we're at 1.3% of the overall tax. I'm going to flip topics to the 2023 operating budget. Our proposed operating budget for 2023 is $1.3 billion. We'll start by looking at the overall operating budget, and we'll follow up by drilling into each division's budget. The 2023 proposed operating budget is an $86 million increase, or 7% from 2022. This slide notes the breakouts between operating, pass-through, debt service, and other post-employment benefits corresponding to last year's adopted budget. Our OPEB fund reflects our fully funded status of a retiree healthcare liability and the earnings on the OPEB fund balance to pay retirees medical premiums. Our OPEB fund is managed by the State Board of Investments, and through the years, we have managed this account to say that fully funded is greater than 100%. This will allow us, in economies just like this one, that we remain fully funded. In 2022 and 2023, we'll be watching the balance of this account to ensure that this plan does remain fully funded, and this budget current increase is due to the interest on those funds. The pass-through funding is relatively stable year over year and is reflected in the timing of drawdowns. We've talked about our debt service pressures on the levy, and Lisa will talk about more details about the debt service pressures of environmental services budget. Our operations year over year, on the right side of this chart, we burst out year over year comparison that represents a $74 million increase, or 8% of the prior year adopted budget. This is mainly due to salaries and benefits that represent 61% of our operating budget. The increase this year is $40 million over the adopted 2022 budget, or 7% over last year's adopted budget. This increase is mainly due to Metro Transit for increased service routes and headcount, an increase in wages for incentives of employment here at the council, and investments in the current staff for wage alignments. $7 million increase is on contracted services related to our transit provider contracts and light rail structure maintenance. Other is the remaining operating expenses, which is up $27 million, and the main driver is fuel, utilities, extra cleaning supplies, and increase in insurance costs. Our proposed 2023 budget in these pie charts shows the uses and the sources of the operating budget. The left side of the pie chart shows the budget breakout by division. And please note that the RA budget is mostly allocated and reflected within the divisional budgets. The biggest story in this budget is that the pie chart on the right side of this slide regarding the sources of our funding. The federal revenues have decreased 4% from last year, mainly due to the use of the federal pandemic relief funds. Federal sources of funds are still higher than pre-pandemic budgets. For context, the adopted pre-pandemic 2020 budget included $107 million in federal funds. There will be more detailed descriptions of this change when you hear the part about transportation shortly. Fare revenue is projected to continually rebound slightly to $85 million, up from last year's prediction of $63 million. Also note that MVEST is forecasted at $418 million, an amount back in line with prior forecasts. We still adjust our budget prior to the final adoption when we receive the November forecast. Property tax supports 70% of the operating budget, but as you saw on the previous slide, preliminary, this funds our debt service and grant programs and only supports about 2% of our operations. Other income of $25 million is primarily investments, mainly in our OPEB plan. We have planned to use reserves in operation, and that's primarily within transportation of $45 million. And again, we'll talk more about that when the divisions come up. This proposed budget for 2023 supporting 4,793 FTEs. That is up 198 from last year's budget. 130 of them increased in Metro Transit, 15 in environmental services, 14 in regional administration, 7 in community development, and 3 in MTS planning. Part of the overall budget is the general fund operations. To give you an overall picture of the general fund, we have a proposed budget of $109.2 million. This is up $6.7 million from 2022. The funding sources are the general purpose levy, the allocations from the divisions, and other, which is mainly interest. The pie chart on the left, you'll see uses by department. This includes activities for regional administration and community development. Statutorial transfers are also required at $1 million of the general purpose levy to be transferred to the local housing incentive account each year. Also to a change in the levy strategy we talked about earlier of the $500,000 coming from the general purpose levy to help increase administrative costs, and also help for water supply transfers to environmental services. The balance of the $2.1 million is to help fund for future investments in the technology infrastructure here at the council. The pie chart at the right, you can see are the uses of the category, and the largest category is salaries and benefits at 54%. Contracted services is our next category at 29%. For each of our operating funds, the council has established reserve targets. For the general fund, that reserve target is 10% of the operating expenses. Our reserve budget for 2023 is at $10.3 million and is projected for year-end to be just over $13 million. Within the general fund is the regional administration. That budget is $91.9 million proposal for 2023. It's a 5% increase from last year. The graph on the left is the uses by department. Regional administration can be divided into 4 function categories as illustrated in this chart. The administrative services include management of overall council decision-making process, internal review of council programs and finances, legal representation, relationships with other government agencies, and legislation officers. The business services include communications, community relations, recruitment and retention of council employees. Financial services includes budgeting, accounting, financial reporting, procurement, and management of council's risks. Information services provides computer services and geographical information services to the council programs. The uses in the middle chart on this slide represents the general fund budget is more than 57% salaries. Contracted services and IT maintenance, which includes hardware, software, and maintenance, is 31% within the RA budget, and 12% is mainly utilities, materials, and supplies. From the far right on this slide is the RA allocation to the divisions, and is reflective on the services provided to the divisions from regional administration. The increases this year in regional administration of that 5%, mainly due to salaries, cost of living increases, and overall of $2.5 million, additional headcount, which include 14 new positions in the Office of OEEO, HR, IS, Audit and Procurement, and increased in technology and insurance premiums. With that, I'll turn over to community development.
Are there any questions so far, or should we continue to move
Could I
forward?
just, Madam
Councilmember
Chair?
Johnson.
Just briefly too, these are authorized numbers for the division. So for example, transportation transit was 4793, and then all the other divisions. But we still have a problem filling. So we're authorizing, we're not ratcheting back. This is just in an ideal world, if we could fill all the positions budget. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions at this point? Please. Continue, welcome.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. Council members will transition over to the Community Development Division.
So you've been here a while. You know that we have a broad family of services in community development, ranging from housing, planning, and rent assistance to supporting the regional park system, to research and coordinating the development of the region. So a handful of operating budget highlights from our 2023 preliminary is the first is we have about $500,000 programmed for an enterprise climate action plan. So what that means is community development is just going to be the administrative home for this project, but all of the divisions can leverage it. Those projects are still in development, and you'll hear more about that as some planning comes along. We're going to be implementing the LHIA home ownership program, or the pilot, which you did authorize in 2020, but some of that work we imagine will carry forward into 2023, particularly because our grant terms are 3 years, so we'll be spending that money over the term of the grant. This year, you'll be setting the scoring criteria for how we're going to award that money and then formally adopting those awards later in the year. As we do our work, we're really looking to help enforce and build equity and develop equity not only around the region, but also in the work that we do. We're centering racial equity and environmental justice in the work we do, how we scope projects, how we interact with our stakeholders. We're creating real choices in where we live and where we recreate. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I move over to the Metro HRA. We're investing in affordable housing through our Livable Communities grant programs. All of the regional parks master planning initiatives must require an equity analysis, and our competitive grant programs are transitioning to make sure we have racial equity and equity-related scoring criteria as we're awarding that funding across the region. We're also working really hard to support and develop our staff. This year, we're going to be working to update the Community Development Racial Equity Action Plan. We're expanding and building out our division-based equity change team website. That makes resources and training materials a lot easier for existing staff to access, and it's a really good housing location for our new staff when we're doing onboarding. One of the big projects you're going to be hearing about that you've heard about in 22 and will continue to hear about in 23 is gearing up for the 2050 Development Guide. We have $500,000 programmed in the community development budget to help support this work. Again, this is an enterprise project. All the divisions will be able to access this money, and specific projects will be in development over the course of the year, and you'll hear more about that as the work develops. Let's talk a little bit about our Metro HRA. I want to pause here and talk about this graph. Those of you that sit on the Community Development Committee have already heard this. We're having a lot of cost pressure. So on the positive news, we've been having, negative news, we're having a lot of cost increases in the council's per unit cost. And for those of you that aren't real familiar with housing, we issue vouchers to citizens across the region that are eligible. And we have federal funding, and all the residents pay a portion of their rent. So two things have been happening across the region. Rent prices have been going up, and a lot of our folks have been losing jobs or have a lower degree of employment than they did because they've been losing their jobs due to the pandemic. Those two factors build on what's called what we call the HAP, or the average housing assistance payment. That means that as our portion goes up, we have fixed federal dollars, our ability to fully issue all of our vouchers goes down. So what you're seeing on the chart is both challenging and also might be providing us some relief. So over the years, you can see that the average cost per unit that we end up having to pay has been going up, 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 up. You can see it really peaking in the middle of the pandemic. Our forecasts are indicating that this dollar amount might be leveling out. So that's some really good news. We're going to be back to talk to the Community Development Committee and the Council about this later in the year, probably about October. Metro HRA is one of those areas where the federal budgeting process doesn't play real nicely with the council budgeting process. So we're going to probably be bringing this preliminary and a public comment draft budget to you. That's our best estimate of what we're going to get in federal funding.
And later this year, you'll be setting our housing limits. So we have to wait for some additional information from the federal government before we can even have that conversation. We usually get that data from the federal government late September, early October. So just know there's going to be a lot more conversations happening with the HRA as we go through the budget process. Another good news story for us, and you've heard a little bit about this, is the mobility program. It's a great place where the council and the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority have partnered on some innovative work with mobility to allow citizens across the region really have more of a choice of where we live. We are a national pilot. There's about $5.2 million that will be divided between the two agencies. I will tell you that because it's a pilot, some of the parameters continue to evolve with HUD. So those dollars are not in the 23 budget yet, but you will see those between now and the public comment version of the budget, and that's assuming everything gets blessed by HUD. And we fully, the 5.2 million is blessed, just the specific amount per year, and how that program is going to roll out is still actively in development. So the community development operations is really all of our program areas minus HRA. So it's our research department, our parks group, our local planners that you see come before you. So all in, that's about $25 million. And in the community development budget, you're really generally paying for staff time. That's why one of the places that we always say you can have the biggest impact on the community development budget is on our work plan. That's directing us on how we spend our time and the council resources. The next largest piece is community contracted services. Part of that pays for a company that manages the 150 council-owned homes that we have for the Metro HRA. And the balance really allows us to contract for specialized expertise that we definitely do need from time to time, but it doesn't make sense to have a full-time FTE hired with that level of service. So that way, as the needs of the region change, as the needs of the councils change, we can continue to be flexible. And then Marie already talked about the RA allocations. You'll see the community development portion of that on this slide. Most of the funding for community development comes from property taxes. The rest of it comes from about $6.5 million comes from HUD. That's to pay for the Metro HRA staffing. And then the other is the 150 council-owned housing units that we have. We do charge rent, we collect the rent, that's what you're seeing here, and then that gets invested back into that program. The program is making money, and we just make sure that we are using that money to keep the houses in a state of good repair. Our pass-through program in community development is about $120 million. That's three primary pieces. The first is the HRA voucher program. Those vouchers are awarded to citizens, and then the council pays private landlords across the region. Our Livable Communities Grant Program, those are grants that the council sets the scoring criteria for. They are awarded. What you see, those grants are 3 years. So what you're going to see represented in the budget is the annual cash flow for grants that are going to be lasting 3 years. So just know, over the years, that number is going to go up and down a little bit. We gauge this number based upon financial reporting we ask of our grantees. So it is their best estimate of when they are going to spend the money, and that's what you see represented here. And the funds sit in a reserve account until we need to spend them on those multi-year grants. The smaller piece is parks. That's about $10 million. Those funds are appropriated by the state and allocated by formula to the 10 parks implementing agencies. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any questions? No, thank you. Oh, Councilmember Gonzalez.
Thank you. Just a quick question on the slide number 25 on the average yearly cost per unit. And the costs are leveling, as you mentioned, but even before the pandemic, they were climbing really fast. So are we going to see that trend to continue, the sharp increases in the next future, or is the leveling that we're seeing right now, is that a sign of something that is happening?
Madam Chair, council members, we're not sure. We are really fortunate to have the amazing research department that we have sitting within the council. So later this year, you're going to see probably Joel, the manager of research, and Terry Smith, and they're going to come and do some more informational sessions specifically on this. What you're seeing here is really a reflection of what's been happening at a large level with rental prices, right? So in general, as you see the rental prices across the metropolitan area increase, our costs are going to increase. When occupancy rates start to drop and the rental market starts to get a little bit cheaper, that's going to cause that line to flatten and potentially go down. So what you're really seeing here is kind of a symptom of what's happening in the broader rental market.
Madam Chair. Just
Do you
to
have a follow-up?
that point.
Councilmember, is that sufficient? Okay. Yes.
And just
Councilmember
briefly to
Dodd.
that point, does that have anything to do then with our program where we changed how we grant or work with the vouchers to go into other communities where rates typically were higher too? We didn't limit it, but we expanded the program so that we could capture a larger area within the region that people could then actually have some housing choice with their voucher.
Please, Heather.
Madam Chair, council members, that's part of the analysis that Joel and Terry are going to be bringing back within the next couple months. I think they're scheduled to come to community development in September. I don't have that data off the top of my head, but I know one of the, just for those of you that may not remember, we brought, when we set the rental limits that I mentioned before, before it was kind of a standard rental limit for a studio or a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom. We have shifted that approach so it's more targeted based upon zip code so that we can get a lot more granular and really focus on which smaller geographic areas should we be increasing a little bit, lowering a little bit, and that way we can really maximize the use of the vouchers. So that's something that's actively under analysis now, and you'll be hearing about it in the next couple months.
Thank you.
Anything else on this? Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
interesting. Good evening.
Madam Chair and council members, I'm Lisa Thompson, General Manager for Environmental Services. I'm going to kick us off with some exciting things about what we're going to do with this great budget. You're going to hear more of the details from Ned Smith, Finance Director.
Less exciting.
I tell him, I'm the warm-up act, he's the main act, but he doesn't believe me. All right, this is exciting for me, and I think for many, many of our staff. We recently refreshed our vision and our mission, and not because the prior was bad, but because we had feedback that it could be better. And you might ask, better in what ways? Well, I sum it up this way: better in supporting servant leadership, where employees have a shared purpose, but most importantly, they're able to see how their work is connected to that vision and mission. We have roughly 650 staff, and they all deserve to have a line of sight to what they all have a hand in every day, collectively creating. There's a very old story that I like to share. It's about someone touring a construction site who asked 3 bricklayers the same question separately. The question was simply, "What are you doing?" And the first bricklayer replied, "I'm laying bricks." The second one said, "I'm building a wall." And the third one said excitedly, "I'm building a cathedral." That's what we're after for our staff. Our employees deserve to have that opportunity every single day. So as an example, if an operator in our plants were to be asked what they're doing when they're operating equipment such as an aeration basin, we hope that they will answer, "We provide clean water." We've also strengthened our connection to attaining the Metropolitan Council vision, which is to have a strong system possible through planning, coordination, and operations. I think our mission hits that squarely on the head because we are partnering, planning, and providing services to protect the region's water, a very important part of a strong region. This slide you've seen many times, and I know many of you, because I've seen it firsthand, could explain it better than I. So I'm going to skip those details, but just remind you that we ask for a lot of money, but we do a lot of work. We have a big service area. We're essentially serving half the population of the state of Minnesota, and it's really important to us to have enough resources to do that with excellence. And that excellence is demonstrated in one way, here with this graph. It's our operating permit compliance record. We have 7 of our 9 plants receiving platinum awards, which means 5 or more years of continuous compliance. We're happy to see that Seneca's back to a 5-year platinum. Our 2 newest plants, Rogers and East Bethel, are working towards becoming platinum as well. For a point of reference, in 2021, there were a combination of 24,638 opportunities for a plant to miss their permit requirements. That's every day, rain, shine, snow, illnesses, pandemic, whatever you can imagine can happen on a day-to-day basis, or something coming down the sewer that we don't expect. Funny aside, we just recently received those certificates at the National Association Clean Water Agency Conference in July. Ned was able to attend along with Sarah Smith, and it took all 3 of us plus 1 more person to hold the certificates for the photographs, because we were holding up 7, and the others who were waiting to get their photos taken, other winners, jabbed us and said, if you weren't such overachievers, you wouldn't have that problem. It's a good problem to have. Here's some of the ways then in delivering our mission, we're partnering, planning, and providing services. So we deliver a lot of service, but we really have important work to do when it comes to partnering and planning with the region. So these pictures illustrate staff actively working with communities and stakeholders across the region, because first thing you have to have if you're going to partner is a relationship. And that relationship also needs something else really important for us. We need to be a catalyst for collaboration, because no one single community is going to step up and say, hey, everybody else, come and collaborate with us. We need to be that neutral catalyst to bring the information, share the information, and find that there's an opportunity for solving multiple problems with one solution. And that's a valuable role that we play, and we hear it from our communities that we help make it possible for their councils to put money and focus on things that would not otherwise come to the forefront at that time. And we start early. So here you see us supporting children's education. We sponsor educational events, and our staff engages with them hands-on in the learning. And for those of you that may have caught our internship presentations, that's an enthusiasm and an inspiration and an excitement that goes both ways. It's not just the learners, it's the teachers that benefit. I think the area where we've grown the most or changed the most in terms of partnering and collaboration since 2015, our reputation and our results when it comes to water supply planning are pretty significant. Prior to 2015, we had a policy advisory committee known as MOSAC. But now we have a technical advisory committee and multiple sub-regional community committees, and they're action-oriented. They actually are getting some very important work done. They're doing research and studying together to solve other problems as we go forward. And to illustrate how significant that change has been, the green boxes on the left represent now the representation from the technical advisory committee as well as the policy committee. But look at the right and all those yellow boxes. We've grown from 20 communities participating in the sub-regional groups to 72. And that's what you need to get multiple partners to solve a problem that affects many in adjoining communities. So we're very happy, not only because we are growing in participation, but it means we're going to get better things done, because it takes partners to solve these problems that are complex in our region. This one is one of our newest, and it's a little bit hard to look at, but really, you all know we got lots of lakes and rivers, right? About 1,000, in fact, and hundreds of miles of rivers. And they are becoming more polluted, unfortunately, faster than we can take them off the concerns list. So we can't deal with them all at once, and it's not just us trying to help these waters become improved. So we worked with our partners in this region to identify what are the priority ones we should concentrate and focus on. So not only will help us plan our work and our focus, it'll be used by others in the region to focus their efforts. For me, having come from a medical background, this is one of our exciting new ventures. Since the pandemic, we've been measuring viral load in the wastewater flow, and interest in the value of this data continues to grow. Very soon now, we'll be expanding our reporting to include Empire, Blue Lake, and Seneca service areas. And we've also started to look at monkeypox because we've been asked if we could provide that service as well. To say that the epidemiologists are excited to have our data is not an overstatement. Our staff are regularly receiving accolades from the public health community, and we're thrilled to provide this service and value to the region and the state. I might say that I got personally excited last week because I started as a microbiologist in a hospital lab, and our famous epidemiologist in the state, Dr. Osterholm, was just becoming known as a significant epidemiologist, and kind of looked up to him being a microbiologist. And we received, or I should say Steve, who's our researcher working on this, received an email from him saying, "Outstanding work," double exclamation. "Please keep up both the work and your very instructive reports," 7 exclamations. I look forward to learning from you every time I read your latest report. A wonderful public service, exclamation. Thanks again. So we are really thrilled to be providing this kind of service to the region and finding that treating wastewater has some other benefits for us.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And my name is Ned Smith. I'm the Director of Pretreatment and Finance for Environmental Services, and I'll be walking through the budget highlights. Executive summary, our municipal wastewater charge will go up 5.5% in 2023. That's a $13.7 million increase. In a few slides, I'll walk through some of the reasoning behind that and also some of our history and our projections. That translates to about $7.50 for the average resident, or residential equivalent, per year, so a modest increase. Our sewer availability charge will have no change, flat since 2014. You've seen some earlier outstanding housing projections. I'm proud to report that the correlation there is quite strong to our SAC, R squared value well above the 0.95. And I'll walk through a little bit of what that looks like as well. The transfer from SAC is going to be $60 million. That includes $10 million to help us out with PAYGO. And then our industrial waste strength charge is a little bit higher than 5.5. That's because the industrial waste strength charge only looks at our plant expenses, and our plant expenses are growing higher than our interceptors, since it's the same cost to transmit strength, but it's not the same cost to charge it. So we only look at our plant expenses. And then our industrial waste permit fees are pegged to our municipal wastewater charge at 5.5%. PAYGO is pay as you go. That's using capital dollars to pay, operating dollars to pay for capital projects. So what does that mean? It means we're still a great bargain. We are still, and according to the most recent surveys, we are at 35% of the national average for our peer agency. A peer agency is 100 million gallons per year treatment, also, 100 million gallons a day treatment, also about 1 million people. So cities that are 1 million or larger, we are 35% less than that average. A little bit about our municipal wastewater charge history. You may recall from 2018 to 2022, we had our 5-year promise to keep our rate increases at 4% or lower. In 2021, in anticipation of economic troubles from the pandemic, we overachieved there and only charged a 2% increase, which was a pretty big revenue blow, not only to 2021, but also in all future years, because you can't anniversary or grow on that. 2022, we did hold to our promise at 4%, but now we're going to go up to 5.5% to get some of that 2% back. And of course, we're also experiencing some inflation. I'm proud to say we broke our promise to follow inflation in future years. Part of our 5-year promise was 4% or less and inflation in future years. So I'm proud to say we broke that promise for 2023 and only increased it by 5.5% instead of the 8 and 9% that we're seeing across the economy. Going for the long term, we will be at or less than the wastewater inflation rate. That's not an official metric, but it is, we take the CPI and we break out the components and we remove the things that we don't buy, like washers and dryers. And then that's how we figure out what the wastewater inflation rate is. I imagine that's going to be quite high for the next couple of years. I don't think we'll match that exactly, but that is a challenge for us going forward. In terms of where the actual numbers are, these are uses by department and uses by category. This is only for our operating funds, so this does not include our debt service, which is about 48%, 47% of our overall expenses. But in this case, we're just looking at operations at $188 million. You can see treatment services is our biggest piece. Those are our plants. Interceptors are the pipes, the 600 miles of pipes. Support services is the underlying support in terms of computers, training, and things like that that keep our systems running. Maintenance services is, of course, maintenance. Planning and capital delivery is our long-range construction group, and their planning and wastewater planning for how we grow the system. Water resource planning that's our water supply group and also our forecasting group. And then utility maintenance systems, that is our water quality, water assessment. And then administration looks large, particularly those of you that are from city government. That is not, that has some other things in it that make us a little bit different to apples and oranges for what cities typically think of for administration. Biggest piece in there is that's our RA allocations. That's all of our centralized services. And also information services, information technology is in there, as well as PAYGO, pay as you go. That's at $11 million. And then also our centralized project fund, centralized project reserve, which is kind of our contingency fund. Those are all baked into administration. So it's a little bit of a bigger category than cities typically think of. In terms of uses by category, you can see our biggest investment is in our people, salaries and benefits of 43%. And then contract services is the work that we contract out, things like electrical PM, preventative maintenance, security, janitorial, and other things. Materials and supplies is the materials that we use to keep the system running. RA allocations, I just spoke to that. And then utilities, that's where we've seen a pretty big bump. That's also what was driving some of our 5.5% increase. We've also seen a pretty good increase in chemicals, and that is in our materials and supplies. And we expect to see that trend continuing. And in fact, we built this budget in March. We have since learned it's even higher than we thought. So that will be a challenge for us in 2023. But the rest is our PAYGO, pay as you go, where, as we discussed earlier, and then other. If you looked at this versus a prior year, it wouldn't change much. You would see chemicals and utilities just a tick higher as a percent of the total because of the inflation we're seeing there. In terms of how do we pay for all this, the biggest chunk is from our municipal wastewater fees. We are a wholesaler to our 111 customer municipalities. So that is the money that we send out, the charges that we send out to them to operate our system. Industrial wastewater fees, we spoke about that earlier. Those are our permitting as well as our strength charges. And then other can include pass-through grants, and other revenue from interest on income and things like that, and then our reserves. Those of you who play along at home might wonder where SAC. SAC is 100% dedicated to paying for debt service. So if we're only looking at operating expenses, you won't see SAC on the chart. But SAC overall is about 17 to 20% of our total revenue. So it's a material income. In terms of where that puts us in our overall outstanding debt, you can see we peaked in 2018 at just under $1.4 billion. We've paid off a significant amount of our debt bubble, which actually reduced our overall outstanding debt through 2022. And now it'll ramp up as we would expect it to as we continue our capital development for maintenance, rehabilitation, and improvements on the system. But we do expect it to continue to grow to just under $1.4 billion again by 2028. So just a little bit more about SAC and the strength that we're seeing. Similar to the charts that Mr. Schroeder showed, you can see that we had 26,000 SAC units in 2021. Now that is a combination of residential and commercial that's in there. but our residential was very strong. But we were relieved to see that even in 2021, our commercial was showing signs of recovery. So commercial was quite a bit higher than 2020. Overall, interesting fact, to see 26,000 units, you would have to go back to the late 80s for that level of development. Those strong SAC units have helped us to build up a strong SAC reserve. You can see the green line is where our SAC reserve currently stands. The blue line is our council policy minimum balance. So you can see we're well above that, but that strong reserve balance is going to help us manage future SAC rates. So if, heaven forbid, but probably inevitable, a recession does come and development falls off, we'll be able to use our reserve so that we can continue to maintain the rates as we have them now or have minimal increases so we don't discourage further development in the region. And with that, I will stand for any questions.
Any questions? Councilmember Gonzalez.
Thank you. I just have a question about on slide 42, that you mentioned that the long-term goal is to peg the increases to the wastewater inflation rate, but that might not cover the actual expenses?
Mr. Smith?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, council, actually, it would. We don't intend to charge that because we believe if we ran that for right now, it would be in the 8 to 10% range. And we don't feel comfortable increasing our rates 8 to 10% at this time. So we will probably charge less than that, and we will need to get creative to figure out how we still meet the needs of the region, but continue to deliver affordable rates for our customers.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Other questions? I have a couple for you. First of all, congratulations on all the certificates for compliance. That's really, really exciting. And also, I think kudos for the forethought and planning that you do that allow us to weather some of these unexpected things that come about without having to dramatically increase or change. And I think, your SAC reserve shows that really, that illustration is really, really dramatic in understanding how you really are cautious and thinking ahead. So thank you for all of that. I'm wondering if I think, Lisa, you mentioned monkeypox. I'm wondering if there are communities or stakeholders that are asking you to expand the various things that you might be looking for in water treatment with the success of Omicron and the variants that you've been able to advise on.
Madam Chair and council members, there's definitely discussions. We're part of a joint group that includes the Department of Health, and they're actually funding the COVID-related testing that we're doing. Monkeypox is the first one that's come up on the radar as a possibility, depending upon how significantly it would spread. Anything that's viral, if we can determine what to measure in terms of viral particles, and we partner with the U, so we collect samples and do certain things to prepare it for them, and then they do the analysis. So there's a lot of willing partnership there, I would say, and where there's a need, I think we can look at being able to fill that. So the expansion to 3 other service areas for reporting, that's as a result of interest in being able to stratify the results and not just look at the metro plant for indicators for viral load. So we may, break that down even further as we go forward.
Well, thank you for that. I think, again, it illustrates how important the work that Environmental Services does and the Met Council does on behalf of all of our communities, and how we can partner with others to really bring forth. I think many people don't stop to think about the various ways that their lives are touched, and certainly this is one that's been really dramatic, really important, and really reflects the great work that's being done. So thank you for you and your staff and all the work that's being done. That's great.
Thank you as well.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay. Moving on. Good afternoon.
I see they're leaving me alone up here. Where are my friends? Throw them under the bus.
No solo.
I just want to mention, I so much appreciate Lisa's introductory comments. They do such great work at ES, and I love her stories, and I love her comments, and as during my tenure of RA, I also was able to appreciate firsthand all the great work that they do. I drew the short straw tonight. I've been tasked with delivering a more cautionary tale on the transit budget and the transit budget outlook. And typically, we like to tell the stories that are the good stories that are going on in transit, and there are many of them. We have a lot of work going on with our strategic operations plan that is really positive work, and we meet regularly on it, and we report regularly on it, and it's really good work. But I want to focus my introductory comments on some of the risks that we're facing in the transit budget. We often say that we're in unprecedented times, and our budget outlook reflects the uncertainty of those times. Transit continues to face significant challenges, and there are many still unanswered questions about transit demand and transit funding and ultimately transit services for both the mid and long term. But I am pleased to see that we are seeing an increase today in transit use and demand, so we're still rebounding. I looked at some numbers this morning, and that just came out, and we were at 67% of pre-COVID ridership. Keep in mind that at one time we dropped to almost 20% of pre-COVID ridership in our services, and so we're seeing a steady increase, and that is part of the good news that we have today. And then our preliminary 2023 transportation budget really does focus investment on the base cost of delivering services and improving services to our customer, and we're able to balance that budget through the use of one-time federal funds and reserves. But as you know, we still face a long-term structural deficit in our transit outlook. One-time funds are currently forecasted to balance the transit budget through calendar year 2026, but I want to emphasize that this is a multi-year high-risk forecast with many risks that can fall in either direction. And just to cite some examples, we rely so heavily on the motor vehicle sales tax, and the motor vehicle sales tax has performed well during the pandemic, but it remains a volatile revenue source, especially as we face high inflation, rising interest rates, and supply chain issues that all have proven to negatively affect car sales in the past. So we're watching the motor vehicle sales tax revenue source really, really closely. Ridership growth expectations are still uncertain due to the changes to the work schedules and travel behavior that will influence travel demand and fare revenues. And we have spoken here many times about our workforce risk issues, our workforce requirements, and the difficulty we have in meeting those requirements. And we've been unable to hire the workforce necessary to offer the services we want to provide. In fact, we've been reducing services in our quarterly pick. We've been wanting to go the opposite direction. We had to go the other way. We are down 300 operators from where we're budgeted at 95% service levels to bring us to 75% service levels, only because we don't have the workforce to do more than that. 95% may not be the right level today, but we want to be much better than 75% service levels, and I think that's part of the work in the future. I think this is the greatest risk to transit, the issue of workforce availability and workforce development. I really think it's the greatest risk to the Metropolitan Council, quite honestly. I think workforce issues are so in question right now, and the ability for us to get not just drivers, but mechanics and other workers in our areas of operation, not being able to do that prevents us from doing everything we want to do, and prevents us from doing it with the quality that we want to do it. And it's truly a huge risk to our transit future, and it's a huge risk in that way to the Metropolitan Council, but also as it applies to other work units in the Metropolitan Council. We're facing higher fuel costs and increased costs of parts and equipment. I'll mention that even in today's budget, even though we hedge, today's budget will show, I believe, and I'll have Ed correct me if we're wrong, that we're experiencing in Metro Transit a 40% increase in fuel costs just because of the difference of what we hedged this 2 years ago for this year and what we hedged the prior year. And the fuel costs of today we'll be experiencing 2 years out. And so we're not just going to get through it, it's going to continue with us for some time. And so that, and then as I think Lisa and Ned pointed to, we're also experiencing higher prices for parts and equipment and all those things due to inflation and supply chain issues. So these are the examples of some of the long-term risks we face. But again, one-time funding sources of federal revenue and reserves stabilize our near-term budget. One thing we do believe we know is that the future travel behavior and transit demand will be different from what we anticipated pre-COVID in 2019. So we're now beginning the work to map a longer-term view of transit in our region, and one that considers how expected changes in transit demand patterns and our risk outlook should inform what services we both want to deliver and consider what services we can deliver in the coming years. So I feel like it's important that I mention these things to you. It's what we're facing in transit. It's the long-term risk in transit. And I'm now going to turn it over to Ed and Heather to give you perhaps better information. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your candor and transparency. I know those are not the happiest notes to deliver, but I really appreciate that you're honest about where we are and what we're facing. I think it really helps us in understanding the challenges.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Good evening.
Good evening, Madam Chair, committee members. Ed Petrie, I'm Director of Finance, Metro Transit.
And Heather Augustin-Huebner, Director of Finance for Metropolitan Transportation Services.
Well, Wes pretty well gave you an overall overview of the budget, the concerns we have, the risks we have, so we'll kind of fill in some of the blanks as we go here. First of all, the budget that we're talking about this evening, it's for the full transit line of services. It includes a full Metro Transit family, which would be the bus, Metro Transit Blue, the Metro Blue and the Green Line, North Star Commuter Rail, our orange and our red lines, the AC, D, BRTs, and all of our capital project development. On the MTS side, it includes all the contracted bus services, Metro Mobility, Planning, Transit Link, and Van Pool. So that's all under the transportation umbrella. When we develop our budget, there's a few different things that we look at for the budget development basis. First of all, we look at the Thrive MSP 2040 and Transportation Policy Plan. With the Transportation Policy Plan, that sets all the standards for our service. And it stands for both regional services, including Metropolitan Council and the suburban transit services. It looks at all routes, evaluates our routes, determines the routes that are actually meeting the performance standards. Routes that are not meeting the performance standards, we look at, we do what's called harvest and reinvest. If it's not meeting the standard, we will harvest those hours and put them into another route that we think would potentially meet closer to the regional standards. We also have all of our various labor agreements. The largest one would be the ATU. That will be coming up in 2023, but we do have some assumptions in our budget for that. Fair policy, which you're very aware of, the council works on fair policy. We work with the council on that, setting what the fares are and what the fair policy should be. That's a basis for our development. Federal relief funds that we have talked about, if you recall, we were the recipient of 3 different levels of federal relief dollars. CARES, CRISA, and ARP. The council received just over $725 million, of which about $686 of that stayed for council operations. We've used those funds in 2020 and 21. We're using them in 2022. We'll be using them in 23, and then for the future years going forward to help to balance our budget. We rely a lot on the right-hand side, a lot on forecasts and legislation to build our budget. One of the things that we do is we do a multi-year forecast. We've talked about you many times. We look at the first year, the current year, and then forecast out for the next 4 years. It's historically been called the toolbox, but it's our multi-year forecast. We also look at motor vehicle sales tax. We get motor vehicle sales tax forecasts twice a year. We get them in February and November. The proposed budget that we're talking about this evening was based upon the February forecast from the state of Minnesota. We'll get another forecast then in November, of which we'll then, when we come to the council then in December for adoption, we will let you know if there's any changes from the February forecast and then recommended changes before we adopt then in December. We also have state general fund appropriations, which goes to fund our light rail operations, commuter rail operations, and metro mobility. We have our federal relief funds that we've talked about. One of the big things with the state appropriations, if you recall, metro mobility will become a forecasted program starting in state fiscal year 2026. It doesn't impact the 2023 budget, but it's something out there that's coming. We're very happy about that. So that will take care of metro mobility operations. And we've also gone through a transit equity review with all of our budget managers on our budgets. Some of the framework items on our budgets is, first of all, we roll up our budgets from the bottom up. We go to all the respective departments, revenues and expenses, and bubble it up to the main categories. We've anticipated all the revenue growth, whether it's motor vehicle sales tax, state appropriations, fares. We also look at our levels of service, base service, and any anticipated growth. As Wes had mentioned, for example, like on our bus system, we're looking at a 95% of pre-COVID levels base service for 2023, provided we can find the operators, but it's 95% plus the D line. If you recall, the D line will be opening in December of 2022. So once you add the D line onto it, we're at about 98% of pre-COVID levels for service for the bus system next year. We have our continued COVID impact in operations next year. That's both with the revenue loss. We're covering all the revenue loss with federal funds. But then we also will have our continued cleaning of the vehicles, stations, platforms, those types of items. That cost is an eligible use of federal dollars, and we're using the federal funds that we received to cover the additional COVID cleaning. And then we have the increasing investment that we're looking at investments for the customer experience, security, facility upkeep, and additional technology. As with any budget, one of the things that we look at very closely, though, with the transportation budget is volatility. Wes talked about some of the volatility issues that we do have. First one is motor vehicle sales tax. When the council went on to motor vehicle sales tax, that was back in 2008, I believe it was. And so one of the things at that point in time, we budgeted that 95% of the motor vehicle sales tax forecast. Anything achieved or received in addition to that would then go to next year's operations. We do fuel price hedging, as Wes mentioned. We fuel price hedge. We're the largest consumer of diesel fuel in the state of Minnesota, about 7 million gallons of diesel fuel on an annualized basis. We hedge out for the next 24 months. We do it for budget certainty, not to make fun money, but it's for budget certainty. The challenge that we're going to have, though, is the fuel prices that you're seeing today. As our contracts are coming due, they're renewing at those higher rates. So we're going to start seeing 2 years from now, those higher rates start impacting our budgets. And then we have, the other thing we do watch very closely is our operating fund targets, which for the transit family is generally 8.3% of your operating expenses. Our revenue assumptions, we've talked about the state general fund and motor vehicle sales taxes per legislation and state forecasts. One of the big things that we're recommending that we're working on right now is resetting the county's contribution for the net subsidy for the light rail and commuter rail lines. We're currently in a 5-year master operating funding agreement with the counties, which is at a base level plus 3.15%. Those levels are set back in 2018 based upon what the budgeted levels were and have grown just 3.15% a year. One of the challenges we've had over the last couple of years is that expenses have increased, whether it's on parts, utilities, those types of items, exceeding the 3.15%. So one of the things that we're going to be working on with the counties is asking for a reset of the county's contribution back to a subsidy of 50-50. We've talked about programming of federal funds. Passenger ridership recovery, we're forecasting buses next year at a 65% recovery. As Wes mentioned, our numbers today, we are at those levels. Our light rail, we're forecasting 75%. We're at about 33, 34 right now. So we're down about, we're forecasting down 25%. We're back right now about 67, 68%. So We're nearing it. We're watching it very closely. Metro Mobility is at 100%. North Star is going to be our challenge. Right now, North Star is still holding at about 10% down. And so right now, we're forecasting that they would have about a 30% recovery next year. That will be one of them that we're going to watch really closely for the rest of this year. And to be very honest with you, we will be watching all of the ridership recoveries before the end of the year. And if one of the things that we would have to change besides motor vehicle sales tax before we adopt may be our ridership assumptions, we'll watch them through the rest of the summer and through the fall. We would then come back to you and let you know this is how ridership is trending. We may have to adjust. Any adjustments that we would make in ridership, though, would then be offset with federal funds. On the expense side, we have our basic service levels for Metro Transit Bus. As I mentioned, it's a 95% service level plus a D-line, which brings us to 98% of pre-COVID levels. Light rail, we're forecasting 100%. Commuter rail, we're currently running today 2 trips in, 2 trips out with no weekend and no special events. We're forecasting next year 4 trips in and out on the weekdays, no weekend service but special events. Metro Mobility would be 100% service, and Transit Link and Vanpool would run at our 95% bus levels. On the right-hand side for the other expense assumptions, we have all our salaries and benefits. As we talked about, are mainly per contract. We have contracted services, which is largely on the MTS side, fuel forward pricing. One of the bigger challenges that we're seeing in our budget, though, for 2023 is parts and supplies, mainly on the rail side. Anything that has any type of computer chip involved in it, we're seeing a significant increase in parts and supplies for that type of service. We've talked about our transit safety initiatives, and of course we have regional allocation for the shared services. Ridership, this is one of the slides that when you look at it, it's kind of it's a daunting slide because you can see back in 2019, we were at about 82 million rides. And you can see the big dip in 2020 and 2021 with the pandemic. The nice thing, the positive thing that you're seeing, the swing back now in 2023, we're forecasting that we'll be at about 70% of pre-COVID levels, or about 53 million rides. So once again, that's one of the things that we will watch through the rest of this year and may adjust before year end, but right now we're forecasting that we would be back at about 70% of pre-pandemic levels. The strategic operations plan, this is a plan that Wes had mentioned in his talking points. This is where we set our goals and our core elements that we are operating on right now and working to carry out the direction of the council. And these also closely align with both 2040, with Thrive 2040 and the transportation policy plan. I'll go through some quick highlights and then talk about some variances between the budget. The bus operations highlights for Metro Transit includes the opening of the D-line in 2022, December. We're doing the bus service levels, like I mentioned, 95% plus D-line, which equals about 98%. We've been very busy building the new Minneapolis bus garage, which is called the North Loop Bus Garage. That will open in spring of 2023. We're continuing to work on our zero emission bus plan, and we have staff and additional costs in there for that. Continued hiring, focus on operators, mechanics, both on rail and the bus side. I just can't say that enough. That's one of the things, like Wes said, we're down 300 operators. Our plan right now is that we would be fully staffed for next year. So that is one of the things I've been talking with Wes about that. That may be an adjustment also we may have to look at before we adopt for next year. But we're continuing our focus on operator hiring. COVID, we've talked about that. Continuous evaluation of the budget. This year and last year, this year is just one of those, but we're coming out of the pandemic. It's challenging for us because there are so many different levers, so many different unknowns that we don't know. Every day is a new challenge, but every day things become a little more clear. So continuous evaluation is all I can say. We have a number of FTE additions. I believe it's around just over 130 FTE additions to support the new ventures like the D-line, Minneapolis Bus Garage, and the Orange Line. And we also have county funding for the Orange Line. On the bus system, we have a proposed budget of about $425 million. It is up about 10% from the prior year. So we've done some additional analysis to say, okay, what was the main drivers that was pushing the main increase up and above normal inflation? The largest increases are, first of all, we have the service annualization for the D-line, bringing that on. That's additional cost for next year. We also then have the North Loop Bus Garage, Annualization for the orange line, which would include all the different costs, parts, supplies, fuel parts, all the mechanics and operators. We also have, Wes had mentioned, our fuel's going up about 44%, even though we're on fuel forward pricing. We're seeing a 44% increase in fuel for next year. It's going up from $1.77 a gallon up to fuel forward priced at $2.44, which in today's market is a steal, but our budget is going up to $2.44 for next year. And then we have all the additional costs, as I mentioned, for all the utilities and an increase in supplies. But for those unusual items, the bus system would be at about a 2.8% growth year to year. Rail highlights, this is on light rail. We're budgeting 10-minute frequency from our current 15-minute frequency. As you recall, we're dropping to 15-minute frequency in August due to the shortfall of operators again. We're anticipating moving that back up to 10 minutes with next year. As I mentioned, we have a significant increase in parts and supplies, mainly any type of parts that are computerized, significant increase, and also a longer lead time on those parts for the light rail vehicles. We have also increased costs for our structure maintenance, which is maintaining our our stations in a state of good repair. We're also planning to hire 8 additional station and vehicle maintenance staff to clean our stations, clean our vehicles. And we have planning continued funding for the blue and the green lines. Moving on to the commuter rail family, like I mentioned, it is planned service levels next year of 4 daily trips, 4 in and 4 out each weekday, no weekend service but special events. We also will be watching the ridership very closely on North Star. They have some of the same challenges that the light rail system has, increased parts and supplies and utilities, and increased costs for station maintenance. And once again, we're assuming county funding for the North Star commuter rail line. As far as for growth, both our Metro Blue and Metro Green lines are seeing about 8 to 10% growth, just like our bus system is seeing. Most of the cost increases, though, are due to the parts and supplies and the additional 8 mechanics, and then the structure maintenance. On the commuter rail side, they are seeing about a 4.7% increase. That is mainly with parts and supplies.
All right, we'll do a quick transition over here to MTS. Just a quick reminder that the contracted services include Metro Mobility ADA, Transit Link Dial-A-Ride, the contracted bus. We currently operate about 12% of the bus routes of the council, and the Metropolitan Van Pool. We're facing many of the same issues as Metro Transit, so I'll just maybe highlight the differences to save a little time because I think we're running a bit over. One of the things to know is Metro Mobility is budgeted at about 100% right now for next year. The ridership has come back, and it's gotten a little sticky around about 80%. So ridership is coming strong, but it looks like it's leveling out a little bit, so we're gonna be taking a really close look at that. One of the other differences is that just because of our service model, we do not hedge fuel. So a rough kind of rule of thumb is for every quarter that gas prices change, that's $1 million impact positively or negatively on our budget. So because of when we submitted our preliminary budgets, the gas was $4 a gallon. It went all the way up near $5 a gallon and is now back down. So fuel and ridership are 2 things that you're very likely, we're tracking really closely, and you're quite likely to see change between now and the public comment. The other item that I would just ask is the fuel costs are really, so there's the quarter impact right now. Even taking that out, I mean, the prices are going up, 30 to 40% based upon if we're using diesel fuel or gas. So what Metro Transit is going to feel 2 years out from now, we're feeling in real time. On the planning area, this contains 2 primary functions. One is this is where our Metropolitan Planning Organization sits, and some of our administration functions. As we talked in the community development presentation, we're in a deep planning cycle preparing for the 2050 development guide. The planners and the transportation planners are heavily involved in that work and laying that out, and laying out what the next transportation policy plan is going to look like. We did get about $1.1 million of additional federal COVID relief money from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, just because of some cyclical work, other federal, so we got about $1.1 million more in federal funding, and just because of cyclical project work, other federal money is going down about $800,000, so we've got about $300,000 more in federal money. And there's a whole host of research project and studies that the transportation planners are going to undertake. They'll be back before Council and Transportation Committee with the full work plan, so I'm not going to say a whole lot there, other than one of the big projects that is going to be starting in 2023 is a review of the regional solicitation process. So the financial impact on this budget is only about $50,000. The overall project will be $500,000. And the regional solicitation process awards, hundreds of millions of dollars throughout the region. So that's going to be a big project that's going to be starting for us in 2023. When you take all the transportation services together, our operating budget's just shy of $720 million. I'm not going to focus a whole lot here other than to say one of the differences that you're going to notice here is the Metro Transit budget is really heavy on people. It's heavy on operators, it's salaries and benefits. You're going to see that in the salary and benefits as that dark blue pie. The MTS service model is contracted services, so you're going to see that as the biggest green piece. That is paying our contractors for their operators. So what you're really seeing for the biggest part of the budget is the operators of our contractors, the operators of Metro Transit, and then the orange slice is fuel. So when you take those together, north of 80% of the transportation budget, it's people. It's our operators, it's the thing, and the fuel, it's the things that we need to make our systems go. The rest of the budget is really made up by some of the enterprise services that regional administration provides, and then just other miscellaneous services that some smaller contracts and contracting and a mix of other pieces there. We really get most of our money, I'm sorry, wrong slide. So Metropolitan Bus takes up the biggest slice of the money at about $426 million, followed by Metro Mobility and Light Rail, which are both about $103 million each. We get most of our money from the state, about $460 million. We've talked about the federal money, so right now there's about $78 million in the budget. About $48 million of that is federal COVID relief. Between that and our planned use of reserves is really helping the system get through kind of this really difficult time that we're in. Wes already talked about that. The remainder of funding comes from passenger fares, our local funding partners, predominantly the counties, and those are the biggest pieces. Sorry, I'm having a hard time reading that and my printout. I should have printed a little bigger and maybe I need glasses. The other piece that I'll mention real quick is on the MTS side, we've got a pass-through program. Those funds go to the regional suburban transit opt-out providers and the University of Minnesota. The funding comes from two primary pots. The first is state motor vehicle sales tax. That's distributed via an established formula. We pass that through to those implementing agencies. There's federal dollars, just shy of $3 million. Those are federal operating dollars that usually come from competitive awards. Those would be projects that were awarded through the regional solicitation or through other projects that the agencies have directly applied to with the feds. You will not see any federal COVID relief in the pass-through budget in '23, but that is only because all three pots have already been awarded out to the suburban opt-out providers and the University of Minnesota, and we anticipate they're going to spend all of their money in 2022. We've talked a whole lot about risk. We are very likely, and so just for the sake of time, I'm going to just highlight that we're likely to come back to you. We're tracking a lot of things. We'll crosswalk where the changes are, more to come here. And with that, we're looking at an operating budget of about $1.3 million. Billion, sorry. B with a billion.
A little bigger than.
This is why we're a good tag team. We catch each other when we misstate something. So I guess I'll hold here for any questions you may have.
Any questions for Ed or Heather? Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So you mentioned several times throughout the presentation how the federal relief funds have been used to assist with cleaning and other activities like the customer experience and security, and how it was really critical to our ability to maintain our ability to operate. We also have been able to apply some of those funds to our operations, which has really helped us not only operate now, but move out our fiscal cliff. As you all know, we had a structural deficit in our transportation, our transit operations. What was the original date of that fiscal cliff, and how far would the federal funds, the availability of these federal relief funds, move that out?
Madam Chair, committee members, as Wes had mentioned, right now, in our multi-year forecast right now, with our forecasted 2023 budget, with the forecasted recovery that we're looking at for ridership, then with use of reserves and with the federal funds in there, we're forecasting right now we can get our transit operations through sometime late calendar year 2026.
Thank you. And what was it originally?
Comes.
I'm sorry.
I apologize.
What was the original date before that?
Madam Chair, committee members, that date has been getting pushed back. Let me go back in time. Prior to the pandemic, back in 2019, we were forecasting as of that point in time, the fiscal cliff was probably going to hit in about 2023, 2024. Then now it's been, but since the pandemic has hit, we've been the recipient of $725 million worth of federal funds. So that has helped, along with performance of motor vehicle sales tax, has been able to push that back a little bit for us.
Okay, thank you. The additional, sorry.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Councilmember Barber, I just want to also mention that given what happened in COVID and the drop in ridership, I haven't looked at the numbers, but I can't imagine that I'm intuitively wrong that we'd be in a fiscal cliff right now.
Mm-hmm.
We'd be having an entirely different story if it wasn't for the federal dollars, we so appreciate the passage of that money, because right now we'd be talking to you about slashing services immediately.
Thank you, and that's what I want to highlight, is the significance it was for us and also for our suburban transit operators, which I've been very happy we've been able to distribute those through our regular formula funding to those providers, because they would also be in a very tough place right now without it.
Madam Chair, if I could add one more comment, I think probably, Councilmember, maybe one of the questions you're somewhat asking here. When the pandemic originally hit, and before we had received the federal funds, we were frantically working and forecasting, because like Wes had mentioned, we had seen an 80 to 85% drop in ridership. At that point in time, this is in March of 2020, we started forecasting out based upon that ridership loss. At that point in time, pre-federal dollars, we had enough dollars in our reserves to take us through, at that time, about June of 2021.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a scary time.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
still very scary time.
Madam Chair, finally. And just, thank you. I just want to highlight how important the federal relief was for agencies like ours. I mean, it's important that we continue to provide our transit ridership. I mean, yes, our ridership is still down, but I did pull the numbers that we had for January through April, and it was 12.5 million rides that we provided. It's not insignificant. It is down, but it is important. So, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Councilmember Barber. I second everything she said, because I've had a lot of time to learn from her and understand, how, and Mary too. So, I mean, we're out of the woods for a little bit here, but really we're not, because we have to think beyond this budget. So thank you for all your hard work on this, and I appreciate that. I have a couple of questions, just briefly. I think it's on slide 53 where we're talking about the county reset base at 50%, and we're going to ask them, is it an ask, or how does that really work? Have we talked to them about it? Is that kind of in place already for this budget then?
Madam Chair?
Mr. Petrie.
Okay, Madam Chair, committee members. Yes, per the current agreement we have with the counties is called a Master Operating Funding Agreement. It's a 5-year agreement. It went from January of 2018 through December of 2022. That agreement just automatically will renew for another period of time at a base plus 3.15. But within that agreement, there's a clause called a reopening condition. That reopening condition is a clause that will allow us then to ask for a meeting with the counties if we've seen new costs coming forward, increases in costs, new transit lines, those types of items. So we've been working with the regional administrator, and we actually sent a letter to the counties the end of July, asking them to meet with us, because per the agreement, you asked for a reopening. Per the agreement, the parties agreed to meet in good faith to discuss a resolution. So we have sent the letter to the counties. In fact, I sent notices to the counties yesterday asking for a number, I believe 6 meetings over the next 2 months, so we can start sitting down to talk. So that one of the things that we will be asking for during that discussion is a reset of the county contribution. It's not a guarantee, but it's one of the things that we are putting on the table.
Great, I appreciate that. I think that's important. The other thing I just want to mention, within the transportation budget, I'd really like to see somewhere in this, the public safety, police department section of transportation showing up a little bit. When we talk about the risks on slide 65, we know that operator hiring is critical, but we also know the same thing exists in police. And I think that because public safety is a core principle, and we've had a task force and all of that, it's not showing up, at least publicly, in this presentation. I think that is absolutely critical to how we now position the 2023 budget. So before it comes back in December, I, for one, would like to see that woven in. When you look at our core goals and core elements on 56, let me get there real quickly. Again, I'd like to see something in here that talks about safety and bring some of those elements into the task force work that was done. I know money is being put into that, and I think that it's really important to just demonstrate that. And I'd really like to see within this budget, and I know that salaries and benefits and the folks are all paid for in the lump, but I'm used to seeing when public safety is a priority, and it's a department within a department certainly here, but I'd like to understand, what asks are coming through the budget process for new equipment, important training programs that are coming up, vehicles. I'd like to see how the budget's handling for that side of it, recruitment and retention of our officers as well. I know we're really working hard in our police department to make sure that morale is where it needs to be so that they know that they're heard. But I think safety should be at least showing up in this budget in a pretty significant way, even if it's simply called out in some of our risks that we're facing, the goals and the core elements. I think it's really, I just want to say publicly, I think it's really wonderful that the police department has invited us in for their open houses. I think we've been hearing that the officers are appreciating, and the up through the ranks are appreciating the ability to share information with us and for us to ask questions. That for me, that was very refreshing because I've been used to that for 20 years as a city council member, and I felt very close to public safety. So I appreciate the opportunity. In fact, I'm going to be doing a ride along soon and hopefully having coffee with some folks. So I think that at least for this body to understand how public safety works within this budget, and then publicly for people to understand how the work we're doing fits within the budget, I think that's pretty significant. So if at all possible, not to alter any of our numbers here, but just to demonstrate by the time we adopt this, some slides that talk about our valuable police department and the things that we're trying to solve, and then solve for PD issues that are opportunities, quite frankly, to do better, and then how we can project that out to the community. So I would just make that request, with all due respect.
Thank you. Gentleman Royster.
Madam Chairman, if I can, I'm going to tie some of all of the questions we've had together a little bit. First of all, I think it's a great point. We emphasize safety, and we can separate that in our budget. I will say we've made significant investments in our police department, and I've received appreciation from the department heads themselves about how much they've been supported through the investments of this council and through the support of our division in those investments, and they're needed because of the situation that we're in. So I think separating out will show that better, and I'd be glad to do that. I also kind of wanted to tie the issue of the county rebasing and the issue of the federal funds and those things together. That right now we're paying for our growth in our police department and our attempted growth in our police department, I should say, and our growth in our CSOs, that were part of the initiative of bringing more presence with federal funds. That a lot of that expense is incurred on light rail, because we have a big focus on light rail in that regard. And those federal funds, what we've committed to is paying the counties did not initially want to fund that. They felt it was above their 3.15% growth factor. And we said, well, we'll pay for it with federal funds until 26, and then we run out. So that's part of this 50%. Eventually, it's part of how we use our federal funds to the benefit of our customer and to the benefit of our services, and it kind of ties into some of the issues that you've made. I thought it was worth mentioning.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, just one quick comment. Thank you, Wes. I really appreciate those comments on both questions. And I would just say as well, even that explanation is good, but I think for this body, as we approve these budgets, it's just important that body of work that we provide to this community show up in the budget so that people can see it and understand through all of these other slides how they work into the services we provide, because you see it in community development, you see it in ES, how multiple facets come together to provide the exemplary services that we're trying to have impact throughout the region. And so I appreciate the fact that safety is a priority and that you're getting that good feedback. I think it's important that we hear that too through the budget. So thank you for all your hard work on that. And I look forward to seeing more information without it altering the numbers that we're trying to get passed before the levy adoption date.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the discussion about the federal funds, Councilmember Barber's questions and staff's explanations of what we're doing with that. I think we need to make it very, very clear to the region that that money is committed to operations. We don't have any left over for any other projects, or else we'll have to face our cliff for operations earlier and start cannibalizing service. So lots of other units of government still have some left, and they're thinking of all these great things to do, but ours has been committed long-term, and we don't have any left for special initiatives or anything. My question is, if we don't come up with people to fill these positions that we've funded, if we can't get drivers and police officers and mechanics and cleaners and everything, at what point do we start impacting the capital budget and how fast we can open up new routes? Do we have that discussion with the transportation policy plan? Because that seems like too late to have that discussion. So when do we talk about that?
Mr. Questra.
Madam Chair and Councilmember Wolf, that was somewhat what I was referring to at the end of my opening remarks when I said that it's time that we take a look at both the long-term outlook on ridership and transit demand, and look at that and our current commitments to services and service development, and bring that together and say, what are we looking at right now in terms of the long-term outlook? Because as I said in my opening remarks, it's different today than it was in 2019. And we have to bring that together, and that's going to put to light some decisions that are going to have to be made. And this can become not operational tweaks, but policy decisions, not those that can be made independently by the Metro Transit Division or the MTS division. So that's the work that I say we're starting right now, of putting that information together. And I think that's really important work. And I think we can do it better now than we could before, because we're starting to see patterns of ridership and travel behavior and times of day and those sorts of things. So I think we're in a better position to look more closely at taking at least a shot at a long-term view on what transit demand looks like and what kind of network of services, so that you can see what network of services that you would like to provide in that context.
Or that can provide. I mean,
yes, it's both
what we would like
can.
to do and what we can do may be very different things.
Thank you for that. Other questions or comments? Councilmember Barber.
Madam Chair, just to kind of respond as well to Councilmember Will's question. You're asking the right questions, and these are definitely, I think, actually, the question Wes keeps asking is what we want to do and what can we do? And I think that's really the right topic, and we are bringing up some of those discussions already with our transit policy work group. That'll eventually feed into both probably Transportation Committee and committees of the whole and things for some of these discussions of what is the balance of what we can build and what can we staff and what can we support and all of that. But that is the right conversation to be having, and it will be ahead of when we're doing the transportation policy plan.
Councilmember Sterner.
Hi, thank you, Chair. Just had a couple questions. One's big picture, one's a little bit smaller one. But the one on the budget is like we've looked at through COVID, we haven't used some of the buses as much, so mileage has been down and some of them parked, and our light rail is going down to 2 cars instead of 3 cars, and we've got some money over fixing the corrosion on the cars, et cetera. I'm just wondering what the model would be is if we either like don't purchase new buses and new capital and keep our diesel ones slower, like you keep them longer since they have less mileage on one scenario, versus another scenario being like we work on the sustainability model, fast track electric buses and go away from the diesel and save our fuel costs. Is there a way to look if there's like where we are with our current budget versus 2 possible sweet spots or savings of either one of those scenarios?
Okay.
Mr. Petrie.
Chair, committee members, I'll address your first question first. As far as for the diesel buses, hybrid diesel buses that we have, we've been working very closely with our bus maintenance and with our service development department. One of the things that we've had noticed is the fact is that, like Wes had mentioned, we're down about 250, 300 operators right now. Our weekday peak service is normally around 800 buses. We're down to about 600 right now. So as a result, we don't need as many buses. So one of the things that we've actually been doing is actually utilizing our buses, trying to efficiently utilize our buses, but that's also been impacting our capital side. We've slowed down the last couple of years now since the pandemic, slowed down our bus purchases because we don't need to purchase as many buses as what we had originally historically planned. So even though the bus is continuing to age, it's not aging with miles. So we're able to then take our buses past the 12-year mark and continue to use them with our service. And your second question?
Second question would be like if to avoid the fuel costs that are going up and look like it's going to go up, if we either got more electric buses, like a lower cost, operating cost by having electric. I know we've had issues with electrical charging and all that, but assuming electrical charging is working well and we fast track the lower operating costs and buy more capital, what would that model look like?
Okay. Chair, committee members, that'll be one of the things, I don't want to punt this down the road, but we're currently working on right now our 6-year CIP for 2023 through 2028. And we're doing a lot of work with bus maintenance on looking at continuing diesels, the electrification program, and when we should bring those buses in. So you will hear in about another 6 weeks when we come back with the capital budget, more detail on the electric buses.
All right, great. And then, Chair, I just have one more question. Now, this is a little bit one. So we've had some of like legislative type thing about like doing enforcement of fares and then maybe collecting fares and that. If we were like collecting like at our optimal peak of fares, would that number go up quite a bit more than that 40% of our budget if we were more, engaged with collecting fares and enforcements and things like that?
Madam Chair?
Petrie.
Yeah, Madam Chair, committee members, I look at it, it's kind of a combination of 2 things. It's ridership levels, but it's also fare compliance. Back in the pre-COVID days, we were at fare compliance of 30+%. Right now, as you saw, as Heather had gone through, we're at about 14% today. We have seen a challenge, though, as you are very well aware, we've been talking about, we've seen a challenge over the last year and a half of fare compliance on our systems. So that is one of the things that we are actually working with the general manager, working with our police department to try to come up with some strategies on fare compliance to mitigate that. And if Wes wants to add more to it.
Yeah, Madam Chair and Councilmember Sterner, we have seen a drop in fare compliance. I think it has to do with habits that occurred over the pandemic, over COVID, when we weren't doing fare compliance checks nearly as much. because we didn't want the close contact with police that were needed for other things. And I also want to remind folks that our administrative citations bill is part of our answer to doing that, because we want to keep police doing police work. But still, we need to have a fair compliance program in place. And our plan was to do that through the addition of CSOs and through the addition of perhaps other kinds of personnel that would both provide a presence on transit and would help us to, our fiscal note was developed based upon a certain percent of fare checks, like 5% growing to 10% over time. So one of the problems we have is that fare compliance currently can only be done through police officers, because it's a misdemeanor offense, which is ridiculous on a number of levels. And I felt like last session, according to Judd, we were really close to getting that passed, but it got caught up in everything else that didn't get passed. So I think we feel fairly close to this. We feel like we have some bipartisan support on it.
Right, thank you.
Councilmember Wolf.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to clarify something Mr. Petrie said. He said fair compliance was at 30% and went to 14. That's farebox recovery was
Thank
at
you, Chair.
30%
Yeah,
and went
thank
down
you
to
very much.
14.
Yeah,
Because I don't want to
30%.
read in the paper tomorrow that
Yes,
we only
yes.
have 14% of people paying their
Thank you
fares.
very
That
much.
would be, yeah.
Yep, Chair Committee members, yep. Pre-COVID, farebox recovery on our bus system was around 30%, on the light rail system it was around 38%. Now combined, we're down to 14, farebox recovery.
Farebox, or compliance is a totally different number.
Absolutely, yeah.
From that.
Thank you for the clarification.
Good catch. Thanks for that. Any other questions or comments? Thank you for this. And I think that concludes the presentation for everybody. We've run over, we're not quite done, but I think these two together, the population estimates and then the preliminary budget back to back, are really interesting and really underscore and help us understand the challenges that you're all facing. Thank you, Ms. Henderson, and all of the department heads and staff for pulling this together. It's a tremendous amount of work. Clearly, there's a great deal of interest and clarification. We realize this is just the start, and we'll probably be in touch independently and then follow along as the budget process progresses. So thank you for all of that. It's great information. With that, do council members have any reports that they want to share? No, we imagine
Madam
not.
Chair?
Yes.
I just had a great tour of Southwest Light Rail with Councilmember Vento and you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate that opportunity. So thanks for that. It was I hadn't been out on site, just driving by it every now and then. So thank you. It was amazing.
Thank you for saying that. And again, if there's anybody else who has not yet taken the tour, really, really, really strongly encourage you to do it. You'll have a very different sense of it when you see it, walk it, touch it, feel it, smell it. I mean, it really will give you an in-depth understanding that you can't get from the great presentations that we get and from maps and from slideshows and things like that. So if you've not taken it, please, 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 just ask, because we will find a way to get you out on that and do that. So thank you for that. Okay, so that's that. Okay, Regional Administrator Ms. Bovee.
Just echoing your compliments to our finance teams across the divisions. Just great work, and it really does take a lot to pull this budget together, especially when we're dealing with as much uncertainty as we are in pulling our assumptions together. So just fantastic work, and thank you all.
Ms. Budhart.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will pass.
Okay. If there's nothing else to share, thank you for hanging in there, and we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Stand up.
I know. Exactly. It's a long haul.